Welcome to Breaking the News Plus. On this Wednesday night, we are going to focus on a huge case that the Supreme Court now has to decide. It is the issue of birthright citizenship. This day has been coming for a while because President Trump, on his first day in office of his second term, signed an executive order saying he would end birthright citizenship. It is written in the 14th Amendment, so obviously finds its way to the Supreme Court. Our expert on the court, Tim Johnson from the University of Minnesota, joins us tonight. Hey, Tim.
Hey, how are you doing, Jana?
I'm doing well. Let's get into this case because this one had the whole country watching this morning, listening to these oral arguments, which is somewhat rare, but this is a case that is that important. So, what is the argument of President Trump that he can, in his legal team's opinion, end birthright citizenship?
Sure. So the argument that they make is that the 14th Amendment was specifically meant to allow citizenship for former slaves. It was one of the three Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. And this provision basically said if you had been brought to the United States as a slave against your will, now that slavery is illegal in the United States and the North has won the Civil War, we want to make sure that those folks who were born here from parents who had been brought over as slaves would be considered citizens. And so they want to narrow the interpretation of the 14th Amendment to say it was just for former slaves' children. And that means it wouldn't cover anyone else, including immigrants who've come to this country either legally or illegally.
Okay, so that's the argument of the Trump administration in this case that is now sitting with the court. But it has been some time since slavery. So if that argument were to have some weight to it, why has it never been visited before, or has it?
I mean, it certainly has been revisited before, specifically by the U.S. Supreme Court in a case in the 1890s. The case, the ARC case, if you will, about a Chinese immigrant or a Chinese couple who immigrated to the United States and they had a child. Then they went back to China and their child wanted to come back to the United States. And because of the quite racist laws in the United States that was really were really trying to limit the number of Chinese immigrants to as close to zero as possible coming into the United States, he was stopped at the border in California. And he said, wait a minute, I was born in the United States under the 14th Amendment. That means that I'm a citizen. And he ends up taking his case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and he won. And the justices in that case did not interpret the 14th Amendment as being limited to just former slaves' children. It said that if you were born on U.S. soil in any way, shape, or form, that would mean that you are a citizen of this country.
And the court said that well over 100 years ago. So I ask again, how can this, what is the president's argument, that the court was wrong well over 100 years ago and now it has to right that wrong?
That's exactly right. They're asking the court, although Solicitor General Sauer, who made the argument for the administration today, did not ask explicitly for the overruling of that 1890s case, that is essentially what the argument is insinuating. And if the justices were to say that the president has the power by executive order that he signed back in January of 2025, then there's no other way for the justices to rule than to overturn that case and say very explicitly that the 14th Amendment is that limiting, or that section of it is. That would be their only solution in this case.
The early reporting out of the oral arguments was that the justices seemed skeptical of the Trump administration argument, that may be a bit too far. You follow the court, you know the court. What did you get from today's arguments? What did you see?
Yeah, so it might be a little too strong to say that the court was overly skeptical, but there were certainly more harsh questions asked of the Solicitor General than of Cecilia Wang, who argued for the ACLU on the side of a variety of immigrant families who are arguing this case at the court. The Chief Justice, for instance, said that he thought that the argument the Solicitor General was making was quirky. That's sort of a cut against that argument. Justice Kavanaugh said that if at all the Solicitor General wanted to rely on the court's precedent from the 1890s, that it could be a very short opinion, meaning that precedent is probably one that a majority would uphold. And then, of course, there was skeptical questioning from the 3 liberal justices. And so if you just count those, that's 5 votes potentially against the administration and the president's executive order. So while it's way too early to make a prediction, the questioning certainly seemed to indicate that there are 5, 6, or possibly 7. And if you really push it, maybe an 8th justice to say, no, the 14th Amendment is much more broad than the administration wants to argue in this case.
The ACLU arguments, pardon me, there with Ms. Wang. Now, what is their argument against the Trump administration saying, hey, you've got this wrong, the 14th Amendment is clear?
Yeah, their argument is that the 14th Amendment absolutely says nothing about slavery. It simply says the plain meaning of the words that are, if you are born in the United States, you have citizenship within this country. And especially for those who believe in this legal theory of the plain meaning, it is pretty hard to interpret the 14th Amendment in any other way. And she seemed to get some pretty decent support from the justices, as I said, from Justice Kavanaugh, as well as from the liberal justices. And Justice Gorsuch asked some pretty difficult questions of the Solicitor General as well. So their argument is simply, in the end, from the ACLU's perspective, that no, the 14th Amendment is as broad as the words say, and that is born here, you are a citizen, end of story.
And typically the justices decide these cases at the end of June. Am I right, Tim?
That's right. So we have, 3.5 or 4 months before they will hand down a decision. I would expect this decision probably to be handed down the last week, if not the last day of the term, which would mean the end of June.
And typically, you and I talk about that when the court decides its cases, the rhythm to it, the reason for it. Why do you think this one would be perhaps last?
So I think just because of the salience of the issue and the controversy surrounding it now, the one thing that could lead this particular prediction on the timing to be wrong is if, again, Justice Kavanaugh is correct that this could be an easy case based on how strong the court's precedent is about the interpretation of the birthright clause in the 14th Amendment, it could be handed down sooner than that. But I suspect that there are going to be some pretty tough dissents and possibly some pretty complex concurrences written in this case. And therefore, that might lead all the way towards the end of the term, just because the justices really take some time to write these cases, especially the high salient ones.
Obviously, this is an issue that was important to the president because, again, he issued this executive order on his first day of his second term. And how did this case actually get to the court? How did the court decide to take it? Who brought it there?
Right. So the case was brought by a group of citizens who the president is arguing should not be citizens. It was ultimately brought by the administration in the end on the court's emergency docket. They did rule initially last term on a technical matter and then essentially said, now we need to ultimately decide whether or not the president has this power. That technical matter last term was about whether or not district court judges or federal trial court judges could issue nationwide injunctions, even when they only have jurisdiction over a small part of a state or just within the boundaries of a state like Minnesota. The court ruled in a decision by Justice Amy Coney Barrett last term that lower court judges cannot issue nationwide injunctions, and then ultimately held the case over to hear the merits or the substance of the case, and that is about what the interpretation of the 14th Amendment should be.
Because that's a serious matter. The court has to, kind of forced itself into, no, we actually have to hear this case. We're talking about basically a 14th Amendment that has stood for more than 100 years, and we're asking to change it, so this one has to be heard. I want to ask Tim, because a lot of people have asked me about, let's just imagine and talk about consequence. So let's just say, what if the court did decide to side with the president's argument that the 14th Amendment was limited to that specific group of people? I'm curious about what that would mean on the day of that decision. Does it only affect children born here of immigrants after the decision is made, or could it be retroactive? And if so, how would that work?
It's a very good question because the justices, while they really only deal with the legal issues surrounding the case, are often quite concerned about the policy consequences. And so, in some very important cases, the justices have discussed the retroactivity of the decisions that they make. And there was some discussion of that today. If the justices were to decide that this is retroactive to anyone who had ever been born in the United States, that would affect millions of people who would have their citizenship stripped away from them. And of course, then thousands, if not tens of thousands going forward, if not hundreds of thousands or millions. And so the justices really have to weigh both the legal issues and the policy consequences. And while I'm not one to make predictions about how the justices will write decisions. Part of their decision and part of the discussion they will have a conference tomorrow when they meet with or on Friday when they meet with one another in private will be exactly that. What happens if we make this decision, and could we make it retroactively? And I would suspect that they do not want to make it retroactively because it will harm so many millions of people who are here in the United States who have lived for either years or decades or more in the United States, and that will have some bearing on the decision that the majority makes.
So in this case, that consequence, basically that policy consequence, would have more meaning because we are talking about, I saw an estimate from the Census Bureau, it's about 250,000 people are born in this country to immigrants each year. So times that just 4 years, that's 1 million people.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that will not go unseen or unthought of by the justices as they are crafting their majority opinion.
Was there anything, really last question, Tim, that stood out to you today when you heard oral arguments? You know, that for the folks that are watching this tonight, they probably didn't listen to it, any of it. What stood out to you as something that you didn't expect or really could turn this case one way or the other?
Yeah, I think two things. I think one is how difficult the questioning was for the Solicitor General. On the other hand, I thought the Solicitor General did a quite good job at handling those questions. On the other side of it, with Ms. Wang arguing for the ACLU, I think she really just stood back and relied on what she thought was quite an easy argument to make, or an easier argument than the Solicitor General was making in support of the president's executive order. And while she may have been able to make a stronger argument, in the end, I don't think she needed to make a stronger argument because the words of the 14th Amendment are so clear. I think she believed that was the case, and she believed the justices thought that was the case in the end.
Well, this is definitely one that the whole country will be watching, if not the whole world, because we're talking about people who come to this country. Tim Johnson talking about birthright citizenship before the Supreme Court. We thank you for joining us, I'm sure, on a busy day for you.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. That's all for Breaking the News Plus tonight. We'll see you next time. Take care.